it's not that I'm altogether down on the usefulness of philosophy as a tool in apologetics and that sort of thing. But I think that some people, they overinflate philosophy. They, instead of it being a tool, it's now viewed by us as kind of the be all and end all, right? It's the source of what we believe, and it's the sort of thing that we just spend all our time focusing on. But philosophical stuff, first of all, the source of our knowledge of God is divine revelation, not philosophy. Right? Philosophy has its usefulness. In fact, there's another book that I was going to read something from that I've been reading. Last week, I think it was, last time I did a show, I think I mentioned Tertullian. I read something from Tertullian, and then I was trying to remember this famous quote, and for the life of me, I couldn't remember it, but it's one of my favorite quotes. After I got off, of course, I remembered it. But Tertullian said, "What has Jerusalem to do with Athens? What concord is there between the academy and the church? Our instruction comes from the porch of Solomon, who himself taught that the Lord is to be sought in simplicity of heart," by which Tertullian meant in humble submission to divine revelation. So what Tertullian was saying is that our knowledge of God is a matter of God's own voluntary condescension, right? We would know nothing about God unless God chose to make himself known. Now, of course, God has made himself known through creation, and since we are ourselves created, and on top of that, image bearers, right? We are created image bearers. We ourselves are revelational of God. But this is decidedly different from the idea that man, on the basis of his own autonomous resources, is able to, work his way up to a knowledge of God. Revelation means that God has made himself known. God has made himself known through creation and conscience, quite independently of any rational argumentation that we might engage in. All men know God. All men know God inescapably. The revelation of God surrounds us, right? One of my favorite philosophers, Christian philosophers, once said, if there was any place on the radio dial, and he was speaking many years ago, back when we still would turn the little knob to get to a different station. He said, if there was any place on the radio dial where we could turn and not hear the voice of God, then unbelievers would be on that channel all the time, right? That's the only channel they would ever listen to. But what he was getting at is there's no such place, right? There's no such place in all the world where you are not surrounded by God's revelation. Everything is crying out that God exists. Everything says not made by China on it, but says made by God. That's what everything says. And that's true in our own, constitution. Our own nature as such bears witness to God. And so those who don't believe in God are not somehow not privy to the evidence for his. What philosophers do at best is they're trying to formulate some of this into arguments. But it's not as if without the formulation of those arguments, people don't know God is. They know God is. Paul says they're suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. This is why God can hold all men accountable and will hold all men accountable on the final day, because there is no man who has not heard this truth cried out to him from all the stars of the heavens and every grain of sand on the seashore. That's what Psalm 19 says, after all. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day unto day they pour forth speech. Night unto night they display knowledge. There is no voice nor language where there is no speech nor language where their voice has not been heard. Their words have gone out to all the earth. And then the author of Psalm 19 gives this poetic image of the sun. He says, like the sun, traversing the sky and nothing being hidden from its heat. He's saying, so likewise, the revelation of God, nothing has escaped receiving this revelation. And so, but the idea is that for many people, independently of revelation, we're going to set revelation aside, and then we're going to try and determine what's true independently of what God is, what's true about God, right? Independently of what he's told us. And number one, this is just entirely opposite of the historic approach to these things of the church. The church has always recognized that the source of our knowledge of God is divine revelation, and that philosophy is to be a handmaiden that serves God, right? And to the extent that we employ reason in such a way that it's not in the service of God's revelation, to that extent, reason has become, according to historic Christianity, a whore, right? She's not a handmaiden at this point; she's a whore. That's how Christians have viewed uh, philosophy. Philosophy is only of value if it knows its place. And again, but I was going to read this quote from Cyril. Cyril, this is this is not the best thing I read from Cyril, but it's called Cyril of Alexandria's Christological Dialogue on the Incarnation of the Only Begotten. And he says, it is not appropriate to distress with endless quibbling regarding a tradition of faith so ancient, coming to us from the holy apostles themselves, nor to submit to the extreme things that exceed the intelligence, nor to intervene, and this is the specific part I'm interested in, nor to intervene as arbitrators who arbitrate shamelessly that such a thing is good and another of a different kind would be otherwise truly better. It is rather preferable to impart to the all-wise God the way of inspecting what is his own, and not arrogantly criticize the examined things of his that are good. We have indeed heard, my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are my ways your ways, nor are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Okay, what he's getting at there is that God knows what the reality is with respect to certain things. And it's our place to submit to what God has said and not pretend to be judges over it. And here's one way of kind of thinking about it. I might have told you guys this illustration before, but it's one that's always stuck with me, referring again to one of my favorite Christian theologians. I'll just leave him nameless for the benefit of those that know. But this guy was incredibly well educated. He gets a lot of flack today, but he once made this comment. He said, "My unity is like that of a child walking with its father through the woods." Okay, now what he's getting at is this in the context. If you're a child, there are all sorts of things that you don't understand, right? There are all sorts of things that you don't know about. Your father doesn't know about all of them either, right? I mean, your earthly father or parent or whoever, your guardian or whatever it is, but they know more than you do. And so there are certain contexts that you're in where if you were there alone, it would, overwhelm you, right? It would be too much for you. You would be in peril. You would be worried about, this or that thing jumping out of the dark, right? But in the presence of your father, all those things begin to no longer be worries, right? You know that while you may not understand, your father does, or while you may not be able to handle that, your father can. Well, although it's this little simple analogy, what he had in view here was the problem that is what birthed all of Western philosophy, right? The problem of the one and the many. When you look out at the world, you realize there's an incredible diversity of things, right? There are animals, there are people, there are plants, there are animate things, inanimate things, different colors, different sounds. There's all this variety. And yet, there is something that ties it all together. There's something that causes this to be a unity. Otherwise, it would all just be a booming, buzzing confusion, to use the words of William James. So, what is it that gives unity? Well, that's the question that philosophy began trying to answer, and that philosophy never answered, right? Only in Christianity do you have a solution to this. Well, so the earliest philosophers, known as the pre-Socratics, the Ionian philosophers like Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes and so forth, they began to postulate answers to this that ended up in absurdity, right? Initially, they sounded good, but each philosopher refuted the next, right? So Thales came along and said, everything is water, right? So somehow all this diversity arises from water. And then, Anaximander comes along and refutes him, Anaximenes, and so on throughout the entire history of philosophy, right? In fact, the reason that Socrates and Plato came up with some of the arguments they were making is because when you look at the arguments that these earlier philosophers were making, eventually you get to the point where it's like, this is all insoluble. And so you got this group of people known as the sophists, right? And the sophists began to basically say, okay, this all can't be figured out. Knowledge is not possible. So really, the name of the game is just getting people to believe what you say. So basically, you might say they were like ancient lawyers, right? They didn't think that truth was ultimately some objective thing. So really, the name of the game was just persuasion. Try to persuade people of whatever you want them to believe at the moment. So the sophists came along and basically seemed to jettison the whole idea that we can even find an answer to these deep questions. So Plato and Socrates couldn't abide by this. They believed there was some objective truth, and so they were trying to answer the sophists. Well, anyways, but the point is simply this. Here's my illustration coupled with the little child walking with his father through the woods. One way of looking at what this looks like in epistemology is this. We all have at our, access to or know about a limited number of facts. None of us know all the facts about anything. Now, I would say as Christians, we know something about everything, by the way. That might sound paradoxical, but we know something about everything because we know that God made everything. So one thing I can say about everything that's not God is that it was made, right? So I know something, you know something about everything. Everything that exists that's not God, he made it. And he's the God of it, right? So you know something about God, the maker, and the thing that's made. But anyways, when you look at something, oftentimes the introduction of an additional fact to what you already knew can change how you perceive the facts that you knew before. So here's my illustration. If you were in a building and you open the door to a room and you see two men there and a young boy, and one man is holding the young boy down while the other man is shoving a sharp object into him, right? You would initially, just hearing that, sort of recoil. You'll think, oh, that's terrible, right? Why are these guys doing that to that young man? Why is that man holding him down and this other man shoving a sharp object into him? But now let me introduce some additional facts. The boy on the table is actually the son of one of the men, and he's been bitten by a snake. And the other man is a doctor, and they need to administer the cure to him. But the boy is deathly afraid of needles. But the men both know that the boy needs this, or he's going to die. And so one man is holding him down, and the other man is the boy's father is holding him down, and the other man is administering the cure. Now, with the addition of those details, the story looks different to you, doesn't it? You would now look at this and say what they were doing was a good thing, whereas previously you might have thought it was a bad thing. So one of the things that this suggests, though, is that if you don't know all the facts about something, then you can't, in a final sense, say that you have an absolute knowledge of that, right? You don't know absolutely. There's only one way, there's only one being in all of existence, speaking theologically, right, who knows all the facts. There's only one being for whom there's not a new fact around the corner. The God of Scripture, right? The God who made all things, the God who governs all things, the God who is working all things out in accordance with his all-wise counsel, right? There's no fact that God has yet to discover that's going to now cause him to scurry about and say, oh, I didn't take that into account, so we're going to have to change this over here, and we're going to have to, I'm going to have to reassess my evaluation of that, and that, there goes that theory, right? There's only one being who has all the facts. And that means that in principle, the only way we could know anything certainly is if that God who knows all things certainly makes it known to us. Okay, that's why we can be certain about the articles of the Christian faith, right? On the grounds that God has revealed them to us. What Cyril's getting at here is God knows himself. I mean, I often marvel when people criticize the incarnation and they say, how could somebody be both God and man? How can somebody be both God and man? That doesn't seem possible. And I'm thinking, we don't even fully understand ourselves. We don't fully understand the relationship between body and soul, right? And how those two things interact with one another, impinge upon each other, and so forth. We don't even understand fully the nature of the human mind, right? Not to mention the human brain, right? But the human mind, right? That's why there's debates among psychologists, debates among philosophers. So for people who don't fully understand man as man, to then turn around and say Christ can't truly be both God and man because there are certain things that we don't understand how they can comport, strikes me, Cyril, and Christians throughout history as the height of absurdity and arrogance. God has revealed this to us in Holy Scripture. And Cyril saying, who are we to pretend to be arbitrators of those things that God himself knows and has revealed to us? Now, that's not shirking the responsibility of engaging in hard thinking and trying to, achieve coherence in our thinking and all that. I'm not, denying any of that. But I am trying to put some of these things in their place, right? The source of our knowledge of God, and certainly the standard of what is or isn't Christianity, is the Bible. Okay. It's not philosophy and all these other things.